Happy New Year and welcome to the DC Bar's Brief Encounters podcast. My name is Parveen Huda. I am a co-chair of the Human Rights and Immigration Subcommittee of the DC Bar's International Law Community. I will be speaking solely in this capacity. Today's podcast is being recorded on Tuesday, January 6, 2026. And we are spotlighting two leaders who have shaped legal and policy strategies to address an extremely troubling and seriously underreported phenomenon that regularly occurs here in the US, including in the DC area, namely the trafficking of individuals in the form of forced labor and sex trafficking. Notably, these individuals may include young children, teens, adults, US citizens, and foreign nationals, the latter frequently under lawful immigration status. Our guests today are Martina Vandenberg and Evelyn Chumbow, both of the Human Trafficking Legal Center located in Washington, D.C. The center matches trafficking survivors with pro bono attorneys who lead legal efforts to hold traffickers accountable under U.S. law. The center also participates in strategic federal litigation with the goal of creating favorable precedent as well as facilitating broader systemic change. Martina founded and serves as the president of the organization. Evelyn Chumbow is the Advocacy and Survivor Leadership Director. She previously served on the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking. Evelyn is a survivor of forced labor who was trafficked from Cameroon, her home country, to the U.S. as a young child. She then spent years in involuntary servitude in Maryland to a Cameroonian national, enduring treatment described by the Justice Department as modern-day slavery. Her trafficker was ultimately criminally prosecuted and sentenced to 17 years with crucial assistance by Evelyn, who testified during the criminal trial. Welcome to the podcast, Martina and Evelyn.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. I want to start with Martina, if that's okay. And I wanted to get a better sense of the background of the problem and then delve a little bit into the legal authority and the tools that you have been utilizing, both you and Evelyn, to combat this serious problem. First of all, Martina, could you give us a sense of the scope and incidence of human trafficking in the U.S.?
So we don't really have good numbers, but it's clear that there is an enormous amount both of sex trafficking and of forced labor in the United States. I think we all know that these crimes are underreported. There's a tremendous amount of shame and fear and terror associated with reporting these crimes. And so we don't see the reporting at the level that one would expect. But when you look at the cases that are being brought, both federally at the criminal level and at the civil level, you see that both forced labor and sex trafficking are impacting both U.S. citizens and non-citizens, males and females, children and adults. You're seeing that all of these communities are being affected and harmed. And it was only in 2000 that we started to have the tools that we needed to adequately combat human trafficking.
That's helpful. So I want to back up and parse a couple of those points a little bit more. One of the things I found interesting, because I know there are a lot of myths about what occurs in this area. One, and first of all, is that when we say trafficking, it doesn't have to cross borders, right? A lot of this activity we're talking about occurs in the United States, and also the authorities do apply extraterritorially, for example, to U.S. citizens who might be abroad. And then I think another point is that, as you noted, while the data might be hard to get a clear sense of based on the cases, we know that there are just a wide range of economic sectors. Could you just speak briefly to both of those aspects?
Absolutely. So starting first with the question of sort of where trafficking happens, most people immediately jump to the sex industry and the sex sector, but that's only part of the picture. The rest of the picture that I fear is largely invisible in the United States is trafficking of people into forced labor as domestic workers, people locked in homes and held in domestic servitude, trafficking of people into agriculture. We just saw an enormous case in Florida that was prosecuted by the federal government that may have involved as many as 70,000 agricultural workers brought into the United States with special visas and then held in forced labor That case took years and years to prosecute, and the last convictions and guilty pleas have just come in. We see trafficking in sectors that one wouldn't necessarily think of. The entire sort of so-called troubled teen industry, the kind of schools and programs that parents send their children to. There are a number of cases now being brought against those organizations, allegedly for holding children in conditions of forced labor, masquerading as treatment. And then interestingly, both on the criminal side and on the civil side, we've seen cases involving essentially cults, where in one case, a case that was just criminally prosecuted at the federal level, hundreds and hundreds of children were held in forced labor in bakeries and in restaurants and in homes, doing forced labor for the profit of the head of the cult. So that one of the victims in that case, an enormously creative and courageous woman, filed a civil suit before the criminal prosecution and won the largest judgment in history, $8 million, the largest judgment in a single victim case. So we're seeing trafficking across a whole range of industries and a whole range of economic sectors.
And I think in terms of if you want to call it a growth in sectors, I think maybe that gets into the strengths of this tool, in particular, this civil remedy, because as you noted, there's in some ways just been an expansion because the fact is, I think that survivors are becoming more aware of their rights. And I think organizations such as yours are linking them to the lawyers and to the support networks that can assist them in bringing cases. And I wanted to just in that way segue to talking a little bit about the authorities. My understanding is that in 2000, there was this statute called the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. That statute first established trafficking as a criminal offense. And then in 2003, a civil remedy provision was added, and that allows survivors of trafficking to bring civil actions against their traffickers in U.S. District Court. Can you talk a little bit about that change in the law? First of all, what was the impetus for it? Was it activism, I'm assuming, before Congress? And also talk a little bit about how consequential this change has been in terms of enhancing survivors' abilities to seek accountability.
This change was tremendously consequential. And the private right of action had been proposed in the original law, and the Department of Justice had opposed it. And largely, I think they opposed it because they feared that civil cases would interfere with criminal prosecutions. So in 2003, Congress adopted the civil private right of action, but with a protection for the Department of Justice, so that the Department of Justice can ask for a civil case to be stayed during the pendency of a federal criminal investigation. So that compromise made the 2003 amendment possible. And just to put a human face on this, I was so tired as a pro bono attorney at a firm representing trafficking survivors. I was so tired of having clients in my office literally weeping because the federal prosecutors had dropped their case. What we could say to survivors in that situation after 2003 was, we can't force the federal authorities to prosecute your case. Federal prosecutors decline to prosecute cases every day for a myriad of reasons. But now, in 2003, we have this private civil right of action, and you can bring exactly the same case that the prosecutor would have brought, but you can bring it for damages. And just to give you a sense of how important this is, in 2024, the federal authorities only prosecuted 136 sex trafficking cases. They only prosecuted 10 forced labor cases, a total of 146 federal criminal cases in the entire country by all federal prosecutors and Maine justice. The data for 2023, really not much better, 169 cases total, 181 for sex and 12 for forced labor. And so the federal authorities cannot and were not bringing cases that definitely gave rise to charges of forced labor or sex trafficking, but they weren't being prosecuted. And so the level of power that this put back in the hands of survivors who could find lawyers, and that was the trick. But survivors who could find lawyers, they then could bring their own case, essentially sort of standing in as a private attorney general, bringing their own case, but for damages rather than prison time.
That's helpful. And when you talk about damages, that sounds like that means court judgments as well as public settlements. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. And one nuance here is that in criminal cases, criminal restitution, which is a form of compensation for trafficking survivors, is mandatory under U.S. law, under the trafficking statute. And one of the huge problems that we found when we did significant research with a pro bono firm, we found that trafficking survivors weren't even getting restitution. And so the criminal cases might have been ending in criminal penalties, but the victims were not getting the criminal restitution, which they were entitled to under federal criminal law. And so in a sense, it was sort of a double challenge for survivors. Even those like Evelyn who participated in criminal cases didn't necessarily get a restitution order. And even if they had an order, it wasn't necessarily collected. And the criminal restitution covered only a small portion of the harm and the damages that trafficking survivors had suffered. So the private right of action gave survivors then the option of suing for all of the additional harm and gave them the option, if they so chose, to bring those cases and settle those cases. And in my experience, a lot of the settlements are secret. A lot of them are confidential, both for the protection of the survivor and for the privacy of the perpetrator. But those confidential settlements are in addition to the more than $1 billion that we see on dockets in public-facing settlements and in actual court judgments. And just by way of background, the reason we know this is because the Human Trafficking Legal Center maintains a database of every federal civil trafficking case filed under 18 U.S.C. 1595, which is the private right of action under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So we have a database of every case ever filed. It's now more than about 1,500 cases. We keep track of the damages, and we have a wonderful staff attorney, Ashlyn Phelps, who tracks all of the damages and puts out an annual report on the lay of the land, on the trends in civil litigation, and the tally of damages awards. So now trafficking survivors have won just on public dockets and just in public settlements, not counting any of the civil confidential settlements, again, more than $1 billion since 2003.
Thank you. That's a phenomenal achievement. And I believe that was something also that coincided with the roughly 25th anniversary of the original 2000 statute. I was also just struck by those numbers. And then also, as you noted, the fact that you're tracking this database means that that also provides kind of rigor and these data points that are important when you are, and I think we're going to be turning to Evelyn shortly, talking about how to network with fellow activists and stakeholders and also with policymakers and lawmakers on the Hill. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on what you were saying about the various tools that pro bono attorneys can bring to help their clients, in this case, the trafficking survivors, obtain accountability. You mentioned restitution, and based on some reading I've done, I understand also that they can assist the survivors in obtaining back wages, and that they're, in terms of the kinds of damages that might be available, there might be punitive based on the nature of the conduct and certainly compensatory, and then in some cases, injunctive relief. Can you talk a little bit about some of those other ways in which survivors may obtain justice through trying to access these damages?
Absolutely. I also want to pick up on something that you had previously said about rigor and bringing rigor to trafficking work. The database is part of that and part of being sort of rigorous and following the case law very carefully and intervening where necessary. But we also make the database available to pro bono attorneys for free. And so if a pro bono attorney or an attorney representing a trafficking survivor needs access to the database to find all of the documents that appear on PACER that haven't yet been culled. It's a good way to find all of what Department of Justice lawyers would call ponies or go-bys, to find all of the materials to make assessments on things like injunctive relief. Can we get injunctive relief? There are some very brilliant attorneys who have managed to get injunctive relief in these cases. And one of them, for example, was working on a case involving the fishing industry. And she managed to weave into a settlement agreement injunctive relief that now benefits sort of all fishers who might be held in forced labor. You had asked earlier about economic areas where we see human trafficking. In the United States, but also around the world, we see immense amounts of forced labor in the fishing industry, particularly sort of long line fishing. And there's a huge pro bono civil case now pending against a company that sells tuna, Bumblebee. So there are a lot of opportunities for pro bono attorneys. There are a lot of opportunities for attorneys who want to represent trafficking survivors. Again, you can seek injunctive relief, but there's also opportunity trying to obtain or enforce restitution in the federal criminal cases. There are additional laws outside the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. The PROTECT Act, for example, protects children abroad who are trafficked or raped by U.S. citizens or green card holders who go abroad. There are other private rights of action that can be used. And the Department of Justice, to its credit, has recently made a compensation system available. It's called remission for sex trafficking victims who are trafficked on Backpage. And so now the U.S. government is distributing about $200 million in assets seized from Backpage. And the plan is to redistribute those assets to trafficking survivors through an administrative sort of application process. So the deadline for that, just so people know, has been moved to March. Sex trafficking survivors can apply for remission or compensation under the Backpage remission program through, I think, mid-March. But there are so many opportunities, and it's a real field for creative lawyering that has an enormous impact, both on individual lives and on whole systems.
That does sound like a very interesting opportunity for DC Bar attorneys. I'll also post some links to information about this restitution related program and how attorneys can get involved, as well as other resources in this field from your organization and as well as partner groups. So thank you, Martina. I really appreciated that overview, as well as the deep dive into some of the data and some of the trends. And I think this is a good point at which to bring in Evelyn. Evelyn, last month you spoke along with Martina at a conference at Georgetown headlined by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, marking the 25th anniversary of the statute, the original anti-trafficking statute, which dates back to 2000, and the United Nations Anti-Human Trafficking Protocol, or the Palermo Protocol. At that conference, you remarked that, quote, if you want to create policies that will help survivors, you must do so by talking to survivors. So I just wanted to start by asking you, how do you center the perspective of survivors in your work?
Once again, thank you. It was a great honor to be in that meeting last month with Hillary, and of course to do my fireside with Martina, and also just to see how far we have come, not only as allies, but as survivor. Us survivors centering our voices, it is so important. And I do so, by sharing my experience, sharing my experience as a survivor of child forced labor. And we cannot do that without hearing the stories. We cannot create policies or programs that support trafficking survivors without hearing from the people that have experienced it, that have gone through it, because we know what it is. If you're going to create policies that serve us, we have to be part of that creation, because we know what it is to understand what the type of support that we need. So if anything we do that we want to address trafficking, you have to talk to survivors. You have to talk to the people that have gone through it. And also to see that 25 years of the TVPA, was celebrated, that was done because of the voices of survivors, and also the fact that the White House Advisory Council was established, which it also marks, I think this year or last we're in 2026. But, it marks 10 years of the U.S. Advisory Council since it was established. Literally 10 years, and being on that White House Council, we were able to work on policies. We were able to work with the administration on best method to help support trafficking survivors.
Thank you, Evelyn. It sounds like there have been several landmarks in terms of the statute, the 25-year mark, and then, as you noted, the work on the council. And I want to just pick up on what you had mentioned about making sure that we listen to survivors. And I know that you have, for example, advised members of Congress by providing testimony about your experience, your personal experience, and also your experience working with survivors, and that you've also participated in briefings of criminal prosecutors as well as FBI investigators. And one of the aspects that you have emphasized is that it's very important that there be some sensitivity to trauma as well as the centering of victims when it comes to investigations, that is interviews and the collection of evidence. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So yes, it is very crucial and important, not only as investigators, law enforcement, but also attorneys to help support their clients, the survivors, and to learn how to be trauma informed. We have to be trauma informed. The reason I say that, because during one of my experience when my case was being investigated, you have to understand, I think Martina noted, as a survivor of domestic servitude and a child, I was 9 years old when I came into this country. And my investigator started when I was 17 going on 18. And I suffered through a lot of traumatic experience during my trafficking situation. Like, one of them was my trafficker beating me, with me taking my clothes off. And I understand that they have to investigate the case, and I have to also help with the investigation. But I just wish there was a better way to go about it when I was asked to take off my clothes. That way they could take pictures of the bruises I obtained during my trafficking situation. It was very re-traumatizing. Not only that, also there were males, there were men in the room, and I had to hold my hand to cover my body. And I know that they wanted to take a picture of the scars, to plead their case. But I just wish we had a better method of going about it. And it is very important to just be trauma informed, and that, to be trauma informed and to understand the best approach of when you're investigating the cases, because we're talking about human beings, right? And you're not only talking about human beings, think about it also like this are some of us are children that were forced into this situation, right? So if we are going to plead our case and you want to help them, you got to do that by being trauma informed and try not to re-traumatize them. And that happens a lot when investigating a lot of trafficking cases like myself. And not only was it that I was, a survivor of trafficking, but I also came from another country, right? So I still don't understand the rules and regulations of this country, which is why it is so important to have attorneys there to help us understand those things and understand the process. To your question, I just really want to emphasize, please, let's be trauma informed. Let's get trauma training. And you can get those training for attorneys that have gone through those cases. But not only that, also the ones, survivors like myself, that have also been through those type of experience to help you, train you to be trauma informed. That way you can better serve your clients.
Thank you for talking from your own personal experience in such a compelling way, and also emphasizing the importance that we have this kind of sensitivity. I know that you had a very important advocate in your pro bono attorney during your case, and that really someone who was sensitive to your situation, and that you were also inspired by her in some sense. You mentioned in an interview to tell your story, to let other people know that this problem is occurring. Also, you decided that you were going to work on helping other people in this area and help to empower survivors. what I wanted to ask you about next is this very exciting program, the Harriet Tubman Fellowship. A few years ago, you talked about yourself along with Martina and other leaders in the anti-trafficking movement as quote unquote new generation abolitionists. Can you talk a little bit about the fellowship along the lines of empowering trafficking survivors and also building on the kind of skills that you have developed, having noticed the gaps that have appeared in the system? That is, that we need to work more on centering victims and being more attuned to the trauma that they have experienced.
Yes, it also goes back to your first question on ways to center survivor voice in this movement, in this fight, and which is why it's so important not only to center survivor voices but to invest in survivors, right? To invest in us to be able to support ourselves, but not only support ourselves, also lend our voice in this space. And a lot of times we are always often asked to present, to speak, but never really understand the struggle we face, behind closed doors, right? And that may be financially, that may be family. And we are talking about people that so much was taken away from them. I can also just talk how Martina talked about restitution. Some get it, some don't get it, right? I know in my case, was order restitution, and so far I've collected some, but not the whole amount. And that's why, a program like Harriet Tubman Fellowship, thanks to the Human Trafficking Legal Center and myself, that help us to create such a program to help labor trafficking survivors. I also mentioned earlier, a lot of times when we think of trafficking, we automatically think sex trafficking. We don't think of forced labor. There are so many trafficking survivors that are stuck in forced labor situation that we often just not look into it and not see. With the Harriet Tubman Fellowship, we help labor trafficking survivors to obtain, we offer them financial stability, but not only that, we also help them with economic empowerment and support them with the school of their choice. This program includes a total of $20,000 in tuition for a certificate program or university of their choice, and also a $500 monthly stipend to just help support their everyday need. And the way this program came about, it was just me thinking of my own experience, right? Thinking of if I had a program like Harriet Tubman, I always say, Martina always, is hoping one day. I always say, if someone invests in me the way we are investing in labor trafficking survivors through the Harriet Tubman program, I will be the president of my country, right? With proper investment, financial stability. I am doing it, but sometimes we need that extra support. And that's why we have the Harriet Tubman program, not only in the education, but also if they want to lend their voice, if they want to work on policy, if they want to go on the Hill, we also help them by doing a communication training, right? To say, hey, you're ready, you want to speak, you want to work on policy, let's help you to get there.
I think that is aligned with what you've spoken about in several fora, which is that you hope that survivors become agents of change in their own lives and then also helping others, as you noted, because telling your story is one thing, but then you've said in another context, actions are actually far more important, that it's really important to think about these men and women, and as you noted, many of whom were in forced labor or sex trafficking as children, as individuals who can be self-sufficient, they can be leaders, and that they can also train others in this important context. And yes, that there are so many ways in which one can obtain restitution, if indeed that happens at all, and that could take a long time, but that there are all these other areas, financial, educational, that are critical, obtaining credit, becoming financially self-sufficient, having access to language skills and education. And it sounds like an amazing program. And I thank you for telling us a little bit about it. I just want to close with asking each of you just something that gives you hope now that it's a new year and or an objective for the new year. And maybe Martina, if you could go first.
So I would love to start. So what gives me hope for the new year is Evelyn Chumbow, because the Harriet Tubman Fellowship, the first class had 2 years. We selected the first class in 2024. And because of Evelyn's brilliant work on this and the success that it's become, we're actually planning to launch a second class in 2026. And so Evelyn and her team are working hard, preparing all the application materials, but it gives me tremendous hope that we will see another class of Harriet Tubman Fellows, all survivors of forced labor, all pursuing leadership, all pursuing education, all pursuing advocacy in their communities. And we're going to see another class of Harriet Tubman Fellows in 2026. So that gives me tremendous joy and tremendous hope. The other thing I'll say is that we are seeing important civil cases, large civil cases, cases invoking extraterritorial jurisdiction, moving through the courts and surviving motions to dismiss and surviving summary judgment motions. And so I really think that 2026 will be a year for victory for trafficking survivors who are trying to hold their traffickers and the perpetrators who help them accountable.
Great, thank you. That sounds extremely encouraging. Evelyn, could we turn to you now briefly?
Well, Martina already said it. So, but yes, what does give me hope is also just the Harriet Tubman Fellowship, as Martina mentioned, coming to our second cohort of fellows and also getting ready to launch the second cohort of fellows. And not only that, what gives me hope is an organization like us, right? The Human Trafficking Legal Center. I'm not just saying that because I work here, but I'm saying that because we talked about policy, and we talk about other things. What gives me hope is having attorneys, like our organization that support trafficking survivors pro bono. It is so important for us to have pro bono attorneys, giving us hope to help us, to get our life back. But not only that, to get the justice that we deserve, not only get the justice by having the trafficker be put in prison, but also by helping us to get our everyday life back. And I would say that it gives me hope that we have good attorneys out there. It gives me hope that we have attorneys that are taking cases for free. As someone that used to work in a law firm, I know it is not easy to afford a lawyer, but without lawyers and without pro bono lawyers, a lot of trafficking survivors are stuck in situation without knowing their right and without knowing how they can reunite with their family. So that's what gives me hope, having good lawyers.
And I think that's a great way to close. I think our DC Bar audience is going to be extremely motivated to be looking at how to get involved. And there's a lot of information on your website, but also hopefully, through follow-up conversations. There was an attorney on your website who talked about the fact that it's kind of like their spokes or hubs on a wheel, and that the pro bono attorney is just critical as part of this unified approach, legal, social services, referrals to mental health counseling. And I look forward to continuing our conversation as well in the future. Thank you so much, both of you. And again, congratulations on your achievements.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for hosting us, and thank you for your leadership in the DC Bar as well. We're really grateful for your attention to trafficking and for everything that you're doing.